afternoon. Welcome to our program today on structural racism and youth violence. On behalf of the Baha'i Chair, it's really my pleasure to especially welcome our two distinguished speakers today, Drs. Maholmes and Dr. Abramson. In a minute, I will introduce them. I wanted to thank a number of students who you may have seen when you were walking in. They are part of what we call the BSOS ambassadors, BSOS meaning the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. And they really do a great service to the Baha'i Chair because they come to our events and they help coordinate these events. So I'm really grateful for them for helping us out today. Thank you. I would like to also say that today's symposium, the talks will be taped and we'll put them on our YouTube channel on the Baha'i Chair website. So if you need to go back to that, it should be up within a couple of weeks. For the past 4 years, since I've been here almost 4.5 years, since the Baha'i Chair has gotten started here, although it's been here longer than that, but since my coming here, we've started a series on structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. And the reason for this is because we feel that racism is one of the impediments to having a more peaceful, better society. And I think it's less acknowledged in that manner. Usually we look at issues of peace as having to do with weapons of mass destruction or wars, but the focus here is how do we treat each other? How do we try to be so conscientious about that treatment of people who may not be like us, or people who may have different perspective than us, and people who may come from different communities than us. How do we make sure that in whatever circles we are, whether at work, in neighborhoods, at a university setting, how do we make sure that whatever we do, our actions are inclusive, especially marginalized and less represented groups? So that's why today's symposium is a part of this ongoing series, which is extremely important because the Baha'i Chair really is in a learning mode. It would like to learn from scholars who are doing some incredible work in the field, in their research labs, from which we can learn from. And so with that, I do recommend that you go to our website and see all the different lectures that have been given in this series on structural racism. They're really quite amazing, the knowledge that has been generated in the last 4 years. So this discourse is something that will continue as long as I'm here on racism, because I think until America has resolved this problem, it's not going to reach its full potential. As a whole nation, it will not aspire to what it can become. And I think this is extremely important for all of us to keep in mind as we attend such events and hear such speakers. So it's my pleasure to begin with the first speaker today, Dr. Valerie Maholmes. She is currently Chief of Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness Branch at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. This is at the NIH, National Institute of Health. Prior to this appointment, she managed the Child and Family Processes, Child Maltreatment and Violence Research Program in the Child Development and Behavior Branch of the same institute. She has served and serves on numerous federal interagency working groups, including the National Institutes of Health, Child Abuse and Neglect Working Group, where she co-chairs that group, the Behavioral Health Coordinating Committee's Subcommittee on Trauma and Early Intervention, the Federal Interagency Working Group on Child Maltreatment and Teen Dating Violence Working Group, and finally on the Working Group on Children and Adversity led by the U.S. Agency for International Development. Really quite a rich array of experiences. Prior to joining NICHD, she was a faculty member at the Yale School of Medicine in its Child Study Center, where for nearly 13 years she provided an array of educational, clinical, and technical support services to schools in low-income neighborhoods and communities around the country. In 1999, she was named the Irving B. Harris Assistant Professor of Child Psychology, and 2003, Dr. Maholmes was awarded the prestigious Executive Branch Science Policy Fellowship sponsored by the Society for Research in Child Development and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She has served on many boards, too many for me to list here, but I will just say that she has received her PhD from Howard University down the street, her field is in educational psychology. She has also completed a certificate program of advanced study and clinical training in School of Psychology, concentrating in the neuropsychological assessment and psychological functioning of school-aged children. So with that array of range and depth of experiences, it is really my pleasure to invite Dr. Maholmes to the podium to give her talk on concentrated disadvantage and youth violence. Please welcome Dr. Maholmes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am delighted to be here. I will give my talk from a broader perspective, from the kind of 30,000-foot level of the work that I do as a federal staff member with stewardship over this area of science. One of the things that's really important for me is the thinking about this, and for many of you who are students, I did not know that the federal government was an option for social and behavioral scientists to really explore their areas of expertise and to have a really fulfilling career in answering very compelling questions. Maybe at another panel I can give you a broader story of how I got here, but I was pleasantly surprised at the opportunity to do this process of inquiry. I started out wanting to answer this question about what we were calling back then as disproportionalities. And I just started out kind of wanting to answer that question: is why do we have these gaps? Why is there all of this disproportionate functioning? And that question led me to Howard, and led me to Yale, and then led me to NIH. So it's been a real privilege to be able to pursue that question, and I like to call my career kind of following the yellow brick road to try to answer that question. So I'm here in an official capacity, and I'll talk to you a little bit about my work at NIH, but also make other commentary where appropriate. One of the things that I just want to point out for those of you that might not be familiar with the NIH is that you can think of it like an institution, like a college, a university. There are 27 institutes and centers that make up the NIH. And those institutes and centers range in different topic areas and different areas of focus. And the red area highlighted is where I reside at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. We are the largest research entity within the federal government, and we get our appropriation from Congress, and many of the things that we study are mandated by Congress. So these institutes and centers, you can really think of them like schools and colleges at a university, and the director of the institute, you can really think of him like maybe the president of a college. So that helps to take away some of the mystery of NIH. It's a huge, complex agency, but when you think about it like that, it helps. And each institute has its own organizational structure, which I'll talk about NICHD's structure in just a moment. But I point this out because one of the former directors of NIH always used to point out the fact that these seemingly intractable public health issues that we're addressing cannot be done by one institute alone. One institute cannot solve these problems, but we have to bring to bear the collective expertise of everybody who works across these various institutes and offices to help us to pinpoint some of these areas where we might be able to have an impact. So with regard to youth violence, NIH has a long history of doing youth violence and violence-related research. So I'm going to give you a little walk through memory lane a little bit and share with you some of those priorities and some of our thinking at the time, but also you'll be able to see where we have moved the needle and where we're still struggling with some of these issues and challenges. So in 1993, there was a panel looking at antisocial behavior and aggression and violence-related behaviors and trying to calling for and recommending violence research to focus on the powerful effects of context in which violence occurs. So this was preceding my time at NIH, but this to me signals that we're moving away from this blaming the victim and looking only at individual characteristics to understanding that these things happen in a particular context and that there are the confluence of factors that are come together to result in some of the outcomes that we see, that we have to have multi-method, multidisciplinary studies, as I mentioned, and we have to focus on understudied subgroups, including children and underrepresented groups. But one of the things that I really appreciate was this recommendation calling for community-based participatory research, getting the communities involved and engaged in asking and answering the questions that are salient to them and that reflect the needs and the issues in their community. So that was in 1993, having that call for research and making recommendations. In 1995, one of the NIH institutes, the National Institute on Mental Health, called for investigator-initiated research. Now, you should know that the vast majority of what the NIH funds is what we call investigator-initiated or unsolicited research. So we have some requests for applications where we're saying we see this problem and we want to steer you in this direction. But most of the time, 8 times out of 10, we're saying you are in the field, you're the expert, you know what the issues are, tell us what's important to study. And through the peer review process, we'll identify the most meritorious science. So NIMH called for investigator-initiated studies to look at perpetrators of violence and serious adult crimes and victims of abuse, all the various types of violence and interpersonal violence and crime, because these things don't just happen in isolation. And oftentimes a young person who's exposed to one type of violence may also be exposed to another type of violence. What we also saw at this point was this turn to looking at other major traumatic events, combat and war. Also the impact of technological and natural disaster and how these kinds of man-made or natural events might give rise to violence, might give rise to child maltreatment, might give rise to domestic abuse, might give rise to other kinds of problems. They also call for studies looking at refugee trauma, relocation, and torture. We have and this is the old funding announcement, and you can see the key words for what they called for, what they were looking for at the time. The key words of stress and violent behavior, risk factors, and so on. I did a brief search just to look at our investments during that time from 1993 to 1995, and you can do that as well. This is a public data set, a database of all of our funded projects. And you can see a search on key terms. So if you were interested in looking at structural racism and youth violence and so forth, you can do that and see what we funded over a period of time. So I just searched on youth violence from 93 to 95, around this time when there were these panels and there were these calls for for research. And you can see our investment here was about 52 grants with NICHD, my institute, leading with about 19 projects, resulting in about $9 million or so, followed by NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, our sister institute, with 13 projects and so on down the line, with a total of 19 projects and about just shy of $22 million of investments in that area. And that was important, and that was a significant investment at the time. And so as investigators were doing that work, we were learning more about what needed to be done. And so in 1999, we called for more research. This time you see these calls now being collaborative with our Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism Institute, our institute, NICHD, NIDA, Mental Health, our Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, saying that we need to stimulate innovative research in youth violence prevention. Now that we know that all these various types of violence occur, they occur in context, and now that we're stimulating science and getting the community engaged, how do we now encourage violence prevention, treatment, service delivery? How do we now take what we know from the basic research and translate that into novel interventions and to provide an important kind of foundational evidentiary basis for more youth violence research? So in 1999, we called for more work in that area and continued to fund investigator-initiated research. And in 2003, this, I think, was a watershed experience after 9/11 and on the kind of foundation of the other research that was conducted, we started to look at children exposed to violence. Now, our institute, since its mission is about children, we focused on, we took the lead in this area, and we focused on children. And what we wanted to do was to look at the theoretical frameworks within which we were conducting our studies. And to what extent are we speaking the same language? What definitions? How are we defining exposure to violence? How are we defining and classifying and measuring children who are exposed to violence? One of the challenges in bringing people together in doing multidisciplinary work is having a common language. So just think about that. You've heard of that little parable about the elephant in the room, and that people are blindfolded, and wherever they touch the elephant, that's what they think. So if you're in the front and all you touch is the trunk, you think that that's all there is. If you're in the back and you touch the tail, that's all you think there is. So in bringing people together to study the whole elephant, as it were, we needed to have a common language. So we were asking for theoretical frameworks and assessments and measures so that we could explore these questions together, albeit from different disciplinary perspectives. We wanted to look at mediating variables. What are the things that mediate and moderate what we're seeing? And how do we look at this is what I think is important and relevant to this topic, but how do we look at the effects of legislation and policy on community violence? When I was in New Haven, I had the privilege of serving 2 terms on the school board, and of course I thought, I'm going to be on the school board, I know what to do, after all, I had studied this, and it was one of the best educations that I had. And what occurred to me fairly quickly was that it wasn't so much that teachers, schools, and communities didn't know what to do or that they were under-resourced. They certainly were. However, it was the policy climate, at least in my view, that was having a major impact on what they could do and how they could do it. And so that was something that helped to kind of open my eyes up in my mind about policy relevance. So we called for research in this area, and you can see this funding announcement, all of the various institutes and agencies that joined us in this journey, which was wonderful. And we funded these grants out of that particular call. And you can see the diversity of topics, people from around the country studying a whole host of things, from family violence to political violence. I'm just going to highlight a few just in the interest of time. One of the projects led by Dr. Sullivan focused on this idea that children who had a disability, who might come from diverse backgrounds, who had a disability, also had various types of challenges with respect to being exposed to violence. So one of the things that she pointed out was that these kids had significantly more stress factors, inadequate housing, financial and family problems, social isolation. If a parent had a disability or problems, that was also complicating the life and the well-being of these children. Other things like AIDS and fetal alcohol syndrome were things that she uncovered in her work. And what she discovered was that children with disabilities had high rates of violence victimization. That these children would be victims of violence and might also become violence perpetrators. But this is something compelling, and we still have not explored this line of inquiry, which I think, given the theme of this workshop, is something very important. And maybe these are theses or dissertations that you might want to undertake. But she had this theory that environmental factors, such as lead exposure, had future violence consequences. And maybe during the Q&A, if you have thoughts about that, we might talk a little bit more. But she thought that cleaning environmental toxins was a violence prevention strategy. And I thought that that was a very powerful insight from her work. And you might imagine why that might be the case. Another study by Dr. Raoul Huesman in University of Michigan, he put forward some psychological theories. He was working on political violence, and he put forward some psychological theories that kids with regular exposure would increase the likelihood that they might grow up to be violent individuals and that they might experience traumatic stress, and that children's regular exposure to ethnic political violence should increase their negative stereotypes and about others whom they perceive as belonging to the in-group and perpetrating violence. So you know, in psychology, we study people in the in-groups and in the out-groups, and his theory was that if these kids had this regular exposure to ethnic political violence, that they might develop these stereotypic ideas and thoughts. And what he concluded was that habitual exposure of kids, he studied kids from 3 to age 18, to violence of any kind, and particularly to ethnopolitical violence, would make them more likely to grow up to be violent individuals with negative beliefs about the groups that were perceived as perpetrating the violence. Again, habitual exposure to violence increases the risk for lasting traumatic stress. And he talked about these as placing burdens on society and on support systems. So that was a very compelling study, and he continues to do secondary analyses from those data. Another study looked at marital conflict and child outcomes, and what I like about this study was that they honed in on this notion of emotional security as an explanatory mechanism for the influence of marital aggression against a mother or father on multiple, that having multiple impacts on child adjustment and adversely affecting their functioning. So those studies, as I mentioned, continue on to this day. They're doing follow-on studies, but we also continue to do this work and to continue to try to consolidate our research on these topics to address these areas where there still remained gaps. So one of the things that we did was to pull together a consensus conference in 2004, and at that conference we were asking questions about the factors that contribute to violence and adverse health outcomes. And at this point we're beginning to learn that whatever these exposures are, whatever these experiences are, they're not just contained in the time frame of that particular violence event, that acute event, but that there's a long arc that some of the consequences of these kinds of exposures and experiences last throughout childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. So we wanted to ask questions about that and to identify priorities for future research. And what this panel, they took, I think, a day and a half to address these issues, and what they concluded after this day and a half panel discussion was a number of things. Of course, violence affects all of us, that some interventions may have been doing a little bit more harm than good, and we needed to show more rigorous approaches to studying violence so that we could understand its precursors and so forth. And one of the things that they wanted to point out was that there were some programs that were shown not only to be ineffective but potentially harmful. So they were underscoring the fact that having a rigorous evaluation of the effectiveness of this violence prevention programs were important. So it wasn't just enough to have the prevention program, but it had to be coupled with a rigorous evaluation. One of the other things that I think was an important kind of outcome of this meeting was that they talked about that interventions to reduce violence needed to be context dependent. Again, going back to that early 1993 panels, that this work has to proceed in various contexts and has to take into account local culture. And again, not only the kind of social culture, but in my view, also the policy climate and what kinds of cultural implications those various local policies might give rise to. So where are we now? We're currently funding research and looking to do more work. So this is a far cry from where we were, leaps and bounds ahead of where we were in 1993, where we had just shy of $22 million worth of research. These are the various types of categories of research that NIH funds, and you can see that these are broad categories, and there's some overlap in these categories, but you can see that our estimated allocation of funding is about $111 million across the board in violence research, and you can see in youth violence research about $48 million. When I did another search, just looking at how these break out by institutes, again, you can see this big change. You see that NICHD is taking the lead with over $500 million worth of research here, and this is how it looks in breaking down. So, as compared to the 19 grants that we had in 93-95, 1,750 between 2012 and 2017, about $636 million worth of funded projects, 165 sub-projects. So the commitment to doing this work is very significant. So let's just take a quick closer look. When you look at these projects, you can see that these red areas reflect the kind of thematic focus of all of those grants that I just mentioned, that 1,750. So you can see some of these topics of substance abuse and HIV and health disparities, mental health, and long-term implications and consequences. So when I hover over long-term, you can see those grants that are funded with that as a part of their specific aims and the outcomes that they want to address. But you can see a focus on child abuse, on mental illness. You can see a focus on alcohol and HIV risk, and the list of some of the projects that are funded, youth development, and focusing on young people in their communities. When I hover over health disparities, for example, you can see the range of topics that are supported under this call: Latino youth, HIV, services, mental health services. These are all projects that are funded in that regard. And then finally, if you drill down a little bit further and looking at socioeconomic status, these are the range of projects that are supported, addressing or touching on socioeconomic status. And so there's a lot to explore, and you're welcome to do that. This is a public data set. We recently had a call for research looking at the consequences, research on the health determinants and consequences of violence and its prevention, particularly firearms. And this was, again, another trans-NIH initiative calling upon all of the NIH institutes for whom this is a relevant area of science to study together, to promote together, and to ask these questions together so that we can, again, invest in research that will help us to answer these questions. And I'll just highlight a couple just for your interest. This is one topic that looks at exposure to violence and subsequent weapon use, and looking at mediating and moderating processes. And what I like about this, I'll have to get my glasses to read that print. But what I like about this topic is that they understand the public health significance of this work, and they're calling for looking not only at the problems, but looking at protective factors that can dampen the potentially deleterious effects of exposure to violence across social contexts. Another project that we funded on this topic looks at brain changes and outcomes in accompanying evidence-based treatment in high-risk youth. Again, the public health significance of this is astounding, and looking to use this research and findings from this research to ultimately reinform the treatment process, allowing for more focused treatment with higher specificity regarding individual vulnerabilities. And to me, that harkens back to that consensus panel that we had a few years back, saying that we needed to be sure that these interventions were targeted and that they were effective. And then finally, the last one that I'll point out for your attention is, again, looking at the psychological and socio-contextual factors in gun carrying and firearm violence. And this team is looking at a cost-effective opportunity to move research to gun violence forward, to look about, to develop theories about the process of gun carrying and use, but all for the purpose of informing interventions. And I think this is the key takeaway that I hope that you have regarding these projects, that we need a strong evidentiary base to inform these interventions so that we can use our funds effectively and our resources effectively to target this problem. So just for the last few minutes, again, I mentioned that I'm at NICHD, the Red Box, and in addition to the collaborative projects that we focus on, each of our institutes have their own independent projects that we want to invest in, that we want to stimulate based on the priorities that we have authority over. So at NICHD, we have our organizational structure, and you can see where my branch falls, the pediatric trauma and critical illness branch. There are 13 other scientific branches that make up the NICHD that allows us to have this human development lifelong focus. So our branch is one of the newest entities at NICHD, and it pulls together research in psychological trauma, injury prevention, emergency medical care for children, to pediatric intensive care and acute rehabilitation. And our mission is to prevent and reduce all forms of childhood trauma, including violence, injury, and critical illness, and to enhance healthy outcomes. So one of the things that we want to do, I'll just move forward from that mission, but one of the things that we want to do is support research that focuses on interrupting the spread of violence. There was an IOM panel a few years ago that talked about the contagion of violence and talked about looking at violence like an infectious disease. And if we thought about it in those terms, then we could figure out how to interrupt the spread of violence in the same way that we think about interrupting the spread of infection. So these are the kinds of things that our new branch hopes to undertake. And we're looking forward to your ideas and your input and your thoughts about those topical areas, and I look forward to taking your questions, and thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maholmes, for that very interesting, not only kind of a visual trip into the NIH, but also the very interesting research that's being done there. And I'm sure during the questions and answers period, you can ask her specific questions that you have about these projects and especially funding. Our second speaker, Dr. Lauren Abramson, is a bio-psychologist and founding director of the Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore, one of few and longest standing programs of its kind in disinvested neighborhoods in urban America. It was established in 1995. The center advances a restorative process as a way to transform our culture by doing the very radical thing of providing safe spaces for people to come together and talk with each other, be it as a way to address crime or conflict, or also to build community. Dr. Abramson has written extensively about transformative justice theory and applications, and has trained and lectured nationally and internationally about the lessons experienced at this center. She sees restorative practices not only as a good way to combat the Jerry Springer model of dealing with each other, but as a way to build a just and caring society. Please welcome Dr. Abramson, who will speak about justice as healing and learning, addressing racial disparities in the juvenile justice system through restorative justice. Dr. Abramson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I really want to be as clear and simple as I can to make the link between the work that we've been doing in Baltimore for almost 20 years now with the topic at hand. And I think that Dr. Maholmes' talk really was very clear about some of the contextual and the things structurally that create racial disparities in how we address young people who cause harm, and also what we label as youth violence. But the things that contribute to violent behavior, I mean, you know, it was known in Baltimore that Freddie Gray, who was killed in a police van 2 years ago, had a history of lead exposure to lead and lead poisoning, and how that affects our youth's behavior and how it disproportionately affects youth of color. The other part of it, aside from the context that can lead to violence and violent behavior, is how we look at harmful behavior in youth of color compared to white youth, and how we label that. And so I hope that nobody has any questions about the fact that there are racial disparities in how we respond to youth of color that cause harm and behavior, and some things that are regular, normal childhood behavior. If anybody has some questions about that, I highly recommend that you spend a half hour on the internet and just Google the topic. But short of that, I'm going to just give you a glimpse into racial disparities in how we respond to youth of color. In juvenile detention, oh, it's really small on my screen. African American young people, it's always referred to as juveniles. I don't resonate with that word at all. African American young people are more than 4 times as likely to be committed to a secure placement as are Caucasian young people. 4 times as likely. In 6 states, the black-white disparity is more than 10 to 1. And those are the states where that disparity is extremely high, but this was from a 2016 study by the Sentencing Project. Now, racial disparities in juvenile arrests are huge as well. In 2010, African Americans comprised 17% of all young people in the country, but 31% of all juvenile arrests. And this rate has changed little from prior decades, and it hasn't changed since then. This was from 2014. And here's the kicker, because we go lower and lower into younger and younger ages. And here are racial disparities in punitive and discipline processes now in schools. There was a study of all the schools in this country, 97,000 public schools. Not all the schools, but all the public schools. And what they found in this study in 2014 is that there's a pattern of inequality on a number of fronts, with race as the dividing factor. African American students suspended or expelled were suspended or expelled at 3 times the rate of white students. And this is the one that makes me cry every time I read it. African American children make up 18% of preschool enrollment, but nearly 50% of preschool suspensions. These are our babies. The racial disparities at the ages of 4 years old. What are the messages that our young people are getting because of this? And what's happening to them because of this? So the work that we've been doing in Baltimore is to try to address this and to try to provide a meaningful way to address issues of crime, of conflict, of misbehavior. And, you know, this was, I'll tell you what the work that we do, but there was one day where we got a case diverted to us from the police department for 2 African-American 14-year-olds. They stole each a pack of M&Ms from the 7-Eleven. And the same day we got that referral, I found out from somebody who lives in a wealthy white neighborhood in Baltimore that there were some kids who set a porch on fire, and the response of the police was to come to take those kids and to take them home. So the white kids who set a porch on fire got taken home to their parents. The African American kids who stole a pack of M&Ms got arrested and sent down to baby booking. There's a huge disparity in how we respond to the same kinds of behavior. And we can do better. We have a different way that is not so focused on being punitive, but focused on accountability and on fairness and on inclusion. And so that's what I hope to share with you. This is pretty much how our justice system operates. This is the four-person of the jury saying, we find that all of us as a society are to blame, but only the defendant is guilty. That's what our retributive system, which is our court system, is set up to do. It's to set up to find out what law was broken, who broke it, and how can we punish them. In the work that we do that is restorative justice, we ask different questions when harm is done. We ask, who's been affected, and how can we repair the harm? Very different questions. How many people have heard of restorative justice? That's so half of you. We'll do a review. The retributive justice system, as I said, is really mostly focused on what law was broken, who did it, and how can we punish them. Victims are not included in the court process, right? The focus is on punishing the offender, the so-called offender, and the relationships that are harmed in the process of this are not at all included in the court process. With a restorative justice approach, victims are central to being part of deciding the outcomes. And it's not so much what law was broken, but what relationships have been damaged. It's a really different way of going about trying to do justice. This, I think, will get posted, and if you ever just Google retributive versus restorative justice, you'll get a million versions of this. So what we've been doing in Baltimore is something that I learned from my colleagues in Australia in 1994. I learned about it, and they adapted it from the Maori, the indigenous people in New Zealand. So I like to say that what we do went from New Zealand to Australia to Baltimore in a straight line. And we've been doing this now for 20 years in Baltimore. What is it that we've been doing? It's called a community conference. And what we do is we bring together a neutral facilitator, that's the little purple dot, brings together everybody who's been involved in this incident, all the people who've been involved in causing whatever the conflict is or the harm, everybody who's been harmed and affected by this, and their respective supporters. So if it's a case of graffiti, you bring together the kids who did the graffiti, not only the owner of whatever store the graffiti happened, but the person who cleaned it up, and anybody else who's been affected by it, and everybody's respective family members. So a typical community conference can be anywhere from 12 to 25 people. The largest one I did was 70 people. And everybody knows coming into this process that everybody's going to talk about 3 simple questions. They're going to hear what happened from the person or the people responsible for doing it. Everybody in the circle is going to get a chance to say how they were affected by what happened. And it is by design a very emotional process. We encourage people, if you're angry, go ahead and be angry. What you can't do is attack someone else. But you can own your anger and you can express it. And then once everybody's had a chance to speak, then the group is going to see if they can come up with an agreement about how to repair the harm and to prevent it from happening again. So we get referrals. We want to use this in any kind of way. I like to say that we're indiscriminate about where we'll get referrals from. We get referrals from neighborhoods, from schools as an alternative to suspension. We get referrals. Instead of going to court, we will get referrals from police or juvenile justice or the prosecutor's office for both misdemeanor and felony offenses. And this is done before going to court and hopefully instead of going to court. And if everybody comes together and comes up with a written agreement about how to fix this and they abide by that agreement, then the prosecutors agree to close the case. Done. So these young people don't go into the system at all. Like I said, we've done over 400 felony cases, robberies, auto thefts, breaking and entering. We want people to understand that this is not just for those, what we call in our office, weenie cases. Because a lot of times kids are arrested for stuff that they shouldn't even be in the system for. We want people to realize that this is a real way to do justice. And what I want to do is show you a video. Can we, just to give you a sense, because I can talk about this a long time, it's a very short video that will give you an example of an auto theft case, a school sexual harassment case, and then a neighborhood conflict case. Yeah.
It was excellent in terms of diffusing the problem that I saw. This is
maybe a more effective, informal, in one sense, way of really having people communicate.
There was accountability, and people had assignments that became incumbent upon them to resolve.
We spoke to one another, and we listened to one another, and that was the biggest thing.
It's allowed a lot of people to hear each other, and that's something that hasn't happened before.
The Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore is an innovative community justice program that provides effective alternatives to juvenile court and to school suspension. As the only program of its kind working in a large American inner city, community conferencing has been effective at preventing youth from entering the juvenile justice system, at keeping students in school, and at building cohesive communities. Community conferencing's alternative to the juvenile justice system brings together victims, offenders, and their respective supporters. Take, for example, this case of auto theft. The young men who stole the car take responsibility for their actions by telling exactly what happened and what they were thinking at the time. The victim describes the trouble their actions caused her. She expresses her wish that the youth learn from this incident so they won't end up in jail. The insurance company lawyer lets them know how these incidents affect car insurance rates for everyone and how this may affect their ability to get insurance in the future. The group then agrees to a payment plan. And when one offender reveals that he's unemployed, the victim gives him a lead for a job. The agreement is signed, and the case is resolved. Several hundred community conferences have been conducted in Baltimore. Over 95% resulted in effective agreements. According to a recent Maryland Department of Juvenile Services study, recidivism was 60% lower for young offenders who participated in a community conference. Victims report feeling that justice was served. Youth and their families gain access to much-needed community-based resources. Communities discover that conferencing is an immediate and cost-effective response to crime. Community conferencing has been remarkably effective at keeping students in school, holding them accountable, and providing parents and administrators with a way to build bridges with each other.
My daughter had an altercation with two gentlemen at the school where the gentleman had felt her breast, and I was very, very, very negative and apprehensive about the conference. I thought, oh, it was just going to be another, hocus pocus, washy stuff, something to do, for paperwork reasons, to say that we did this.
I was very skeptical. Because I thought of it as being something that was taking the place of dealing directly with a problem of a proposed suspension, a problem of dealing with something that had happened here at the school that I felt needed to be dealt with rather severely. But nevertheless, I said, well, I'll give anything a shot. And I'm very pleased with the results.
It was a very beautiful experience. It helped me a lot. I was carrying a lot of anger up until the meeting. At the meeting, it kind of like relieved me and freed me.
The most remarkable thing to come out of that was to watch that anger work its way from point 10 through 0.
What particularly was helpful to me was looking the young men in the eyes and really just basically talking to them, and it was therapy for me, expressing to them how angry I was, and it really, really helped me a lot because I was really angry. I mean, that's my baby, that's my girl. It was like the whole thing had really healed her as well. She felt totally satisfied that the gentleman was sincere in their apologies, and she felt as though she could go on at the school with them being there. She felt safe, and it really helped her out a lot. She's fine, and it's like the incident never even happened.
Neighbors are often plagued by the disruptive and destructive behavior of young people playing in the streets, but few have taken the time to talk with the young people. It's much easier to call the police.
We had a lot of kids who were playing out in the street, and they were playing ball all the time and breaking windows, damaging cars, and people were just really getting aggravated because we couldn't really do anything about it.
Messing up property, agitating people. It was coming out of my pocket, getting my car fixed, my mirror knocked off.
So what we decided was to bring everybody together, including the young people, so they could talk about what was going on for them, and that was the initial community conference.
I had 2 broken mirrors, I had dents all in my car, which wasn't no dents from the football.
It was the greatest turnout. I think we had 43 people there, and a lot of them were children, and a lot of shouting.
Are they bouncing balls off of my car and off the front of my house? Because I get it all the time and I'm really sick of it. And my children cannot come outside until I come home from work.
So the ball play is not a problem, it's something else. So that something should just be over there.
Now you sitting here talking about them playing in your block. I don't see anybody trying to say anything about trying to get a place for the children to play.
Well, we kind of asked the kids what they wanted, and they said, we want to go to the park because we're afraid to go to the park by themselves. And Don Fergus offered to take the kids to the park.
If I can stop going to football already, then I'll take them to the park. I'll get them early enough. It'll be some days. I'll let them know. But Saturday, they'll do right. I'll play that. They'll need to play every day because I'm with God. But I'll take them over there.
Okay, so can we make the agreement that when you guys want to play football,
you come see Mr. Don.
Come see Mr. Don, okay? And the other days that you're not with Mr. Don at the park, no football on the street? Is that agreeable?
I'll arrange it.
Yeah? Okay.
Not only me, a lot of people volunteered to bring the kids over here and play in the park.
They said they was going to get a football team together.
So I thought of it, how would you like to play real football? Not street ball, but real football. They say, yeah, we could.
So then we stopped playing football on the street so we can play.
There's no playing in the street. They discipline. They know that they can be disciplined if they break those rules as far as in the street. And they, yes, that's right, all day.
Coach is going to have them running. There's consequences to your actions now if you're playing in the street, and he knows because he lives in the community with these kids.
The whole idea of this country is to have our people respect other people.
Make sure our neighborhood is clean and don't play football on the block. And when we clean these people, y'all up for these elderly people, y'all up for them yesterday.
Parents are out here now. The parents are actually pushing their children to go to school every day, to bring home good grades, because they know that if they don't bring the good grades home, if they don't keep their noses clean and do their chores around the house, that they can't be part of this team. With the kids now, it has been a great big change. People can sleep on Sundays. Now we're not responsible for other kids to come in our neighborhood that want to make the noise, but these kids tell, hey, you're in my neighborhood. You have to respect my neighborhood, where there wasn't like that at first. You can make all the noise you want, do all the people you want in our neighborhood, no one would care. Now these kids care.
In this case alone, over 150 youth now have a caring adult from their neighborhood who spends time with them 4 days a week. Imagine how many of these young people have been prevented from getting into trouble because of the mobilization of neighbors following that community conference.
Community conferencing filled the gap between interpersonal conflict and crime, whereas before people were calling this conflict crime. It really wasn't. It was people who couldn't get along together. So conferencing has helped us redefine the problems in the neighborhood to where they're solvable by the people who live here.
I like to see it grow. You know, I like to be a spokesperson for this program. I just want to get people involved, and maybe this program would be a tool they got to use to just turn some people's lives around. And I'm sure that it can do that.
Is that helpful to get a sense of what that's about? So it's this crazy thing of believing that people have the capacity to resolve their own crimes and conflicts. And to do this as a way to provide a different response than our punitive system and than our system that is stigmatizing and doing really disproportionately horrible things with our youth of color. I am incredibly proud of the people of Baltimore because 18,000 people in Baltimore City, in the land of the wire, have safely and effectively resolved their own crimes and conflicts using this process. I feel like we have something to share with the rest of this country, that it is possible, that if we, you know, David Simon, who created The Wire, said, we're shaped by the institutions that govern us. And if we have institutions that are focused on punishment, we get what we see horribly displayed in the documentary The 13th. And if we have institutions that believe in people's capacity as human beings to be human with each other, then you get this. And it's not just that they participate in this. 95% of the time, when we have done like 3,500 of these community conferences, the groups come up with a written agreement that they actually abide by. Who gets those kind of compliance rates? Judges sure don't. There is 60% lower reoffending, I think because there's been a human connection. That's a radical thing. Justice that involves a human connection, all at 1/10 the cost of going to court. Like I said, we use this for felony cases, and we just had our juvenile justice department for the state did a study of those cases. After 1 year, young people arrested for a felony who went through community conferencing compared to those who went through court, half is likely to be rearrested after a year. And after 2 years, a third is likely to be rearrested. And we still, after 18, 20 years, still have to fight for every referral out of that system. The other piece of this, which addresses the issues that are just so important, is that 96% of the young people we are keeping out of that system have been African American. So I feel glad that, I mean, more than glad, I'm thrilled that there's something that we can do for our young people, especially young people of color, that is different than shoving them into a system that we all know basically increases the likelihood that they're going to get deeper into criminal behavior. And we can show that we can do something that will keep them out of further criminal behavior. Because it addresses what their needs are. That's it.